U-turn if you want to, Margaret Thatcher famously said, but the lady's not for turning. We can't quite say the same about the current Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Today's announcement that he's planning new legislation that would override key parts of the Brexit withdrawal agreement, just the latest change of strategy from the government. From face masks to COVID testing, there has been a stream of government U-turns in recent months. Let's just remind ourselves of some of the key U-turns. Back in May, the government reversed its decision not to grant the families of migrant health workers indefinite leave to remain here if they'd died of COVID-19. The same month, it dropped the NHS surcharge for health workers just hours after the Prime Minister said it would continue. In June, the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, said primary school children would get at least 4 weeks back in school before the summer holidays. The following month, that idea was scrapped. And following a campaign from the footballer Marcus Rashford in June, the government rode back on a decision not to give children free school meals over the summer. Students were told they could use teachers' predictions for their exam results less than 24 hours after the government insisted they couldn't, and there would be no U-turn over the use of an algorithm to grade A-levels. Then, of course, most recently, the Prime Minister dropped advice against the use of face coverings in schools following pressures from unions and teachers. So, do the U-turns show a listening government or a government that's lost control? Joining me now to discuss that are Peter Cardwell. He's an author, former Conservative Special Advisor and indeed former Sky News journalist, and Sonia Sodha, Chief Leader Writer at the Observer newspaper and a former policy advisor to Ed Miliband. Well, you've both been on both sides of the fence. Peter, when you've seen these announcements of various government U-turns, do you wince, or do you think at least we've got a listening government?
I think a listening government is one that everybody wants. It's something that people want their government to listen to them, and no government has a monopoly on wisdom. The Marcus Rashford U-turn that you talked about, for example, was something with which I think most people in the country thought, hold on a second, shouldn't these children be given free school meals? The government rethought, U-turned, and that was a good thing. David Cameron, for example, had many U-turns at the start of his period of office as Prime Minister. He went on to win a convincing majority in 2015. The question is, does the public mind, and also does the public remember? I think the problem comes when it looks like chaos. I don't think it does at the moment. I think, certainly in regard to COVID, that there are a number of occasions on which the science has changed, what scientists are telling the government has changed, the circumstances have changed, and as John Maynard Keynes was quoted as saying, when the facts change, I change my mind.
Well, that is one of the things, as you point out, he probably didn't actually say. Sonia Sodha, what do you reckon? Is it chaos or is it good sense?
Well, I think there are three different types of U-turn that we just saw in that clip that was played there. So there's a type of U-turn where the government have to be publicly shamed into doing the decent thing. I think very much the Marcus Rashford free school meals over the summer story falls into that. Also lifting the NHS charge for people who work in the NHS, the migrant charge, and giving people whose family members die of COVID working for the NHS the right to stay in the UK. Those are all things that the government should have done. They had to be publicly shamed into it, and obviously, yes, they ended up in the right place, but the fact that they had to be publicly shamed into doing it shows a certain callousness at the heart of this government. The other two types of U-turn, there's one which is issues that they should have seen coming a mile off. So, for example, A-level grades. They were warned time and again over the summer this was going to be a big issue. There were issues with the Ofqual algorithm. They did nothing about it. They let the results be published. They let it mess up university admissions, and it makes them look utterly incompetent. So, yes, again, the U-turn to the right position, but it caused young people so much grief. And then the third type of U-turn is where they sort of seem to do an abrupt turn on what the science says, and I think the science is often quite uncertain and emerging on stuff like masks, for example, but then the evidence base builds and it points in a certain direction. And what it means is that the government, by pretending that the science says we don't need to wear masks, or that young people don't need to wear masks in communal areas, and then they suddenly do a U-turn and say, oh, actually no, the science says this now. They're not treating the public like grown-ups. The public know that science is emerging and uncertain. The government should be more upfront and honest with us, and more upfront that the evidence base is building for something like mask wearing, rather than just pretend it's, you know, the science is all certain, but one minute it says one thing and the next minute it says something else. So 3 different types of U-turn. I don't think any of them reflect well on this government. I think they reflect a government that's callous and incompetent.
And the thing is, Peter, I mean, a U-turn can just be quite damaging for your standing, because, I mean, people like you in your former life, but more importantly, elected politicians go out there and say, yes, we're absolutely sure we're right. This is, you know, as Boris Johnson said over the testing algorithm, that it's robust, correct and fair. And then a day later, the government say, well, actually, you know, we got it wrong. I mean, perhaps they should be just a little bit more attentive in the first place.
I think perhaps you're right. And when I was advising politicians, you know, I always said never be completely definitive on as much as you can get away with, essentially, because facts change, circumstances change, and advice changes. And I think Sonia is ridiculously unfair in calling the government callous. I think that's a really sad indictment of our society, that people say that about a government that has a massive majority and does care about people and is trying its best in the current circumstances of a global pandemic, let's remember. So we're in a...
I'm sorry, Peter, but you've got to agree that's a bit callous. The fact they had to be forced into doing that by a 21-year-old footballer, it's not ridiculously unfair for me to say that that's callous. That does show a government that does not understand what it is for children to live in poverty, to struggle to eat. And I'm afraid that whether it's by omission or by intent, it shows a government that is a bit callous on these things.
Let's go back to Peter for more.
I'm afraid I completely disagree with that. And you know, in her socialist utopia, perhaps things would be wonderful. I think the government does care. I think it has shown that it reacts to facts changing. Also, in terms of the advice it's given, the advice that the government was given by Ofqual, for example, was wrong. Gavin Williamson wasn't sitting there, you know, setting up the algorithm himself. There were people who did that. They got it wrong. Rightly, the head of Ofqual has gone. Rightly, the permanent secretary of the Department for Education has gone. So this is a government that does react. It does make decisions based on the evidence that is presented to them. And sometimes that advice changes. The Deputy Chief Medical Officer's advice has changed. So I think for Sonia to say that, you know, this government is a callous government, which is a very odd thing to say, and doesn't care about people, and is acting for some reason because it doesn't understand how people live. I mean, I would question, you know, look at Michael Gove's background, for example. Look at the incredible work that has been done to help people on the furlough scheme. Look at the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which is look at you know, furlough putting money in people's pockets. This is a government that has spent over the gross national income to support people. We're in a huge amount of debt. And that is because people need to be supported. The government has stepped in, you know, where it needs to.
In the case of the education U-turn, it was the officials that got it wrong, and they've rightly paid the price, not ministers.
No, I don't think that that's right at all, actually. I think there's lots of evidence that Gavin Williamson knew about the problems with this algorithm. He got warnings, for example, from the chair of the Education Select Committee, one of the exam boards, so that they wrote to Gavin Williamson and the Education Department to warn that there were issues with this. So there's lots of evidence that Gavin Williamson knew. Absolutely, you know, Ofqual may have been at fault as well, but they were set a political mandate by Gavin Williamson to prioritise reducing grade inflation above all else. So I think that, you know, Gavin Williamson, he's sought to let officials take the blame and he evade all accountability himself. But there were political decisions made here, and he was aware of what this algorithm would do. So it's all a little convenient, and it flies in the face of the evidence. And, you know, just to come back to this issue, whether this government is callous or not, I think it says a lot, actually, to think that it's a socialist utopia, as Peter just alleged, to sort of think that poor children who get free school meals during term time during a pandemic should not be able to get support with the cost of their food over the summer holidays. That's not a socialist utopia. That's just basic human decency.
OK, I'm going to have to leave you there. Thank you both very much indeed.